Good morning, everyone. My name is Emma Blessing. I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator at Atlanta Contemporary. We've been so excited to have the 2021 Atlanta Biennial up since earlier this year, since February. And it's been so nice to sit with it now for a couple of months and kind of see it in the space. And today we're going to be talking to the curator, one of the curators, Jordan Amarconi, who curated the Of Care and Destruction portion of the biennial. And of course, thank you again for joining us this morning for this artist talk with JoséVillalobos and Jordan Amarconi. Jordan is a Washington, D.C. based art historian, educator, critic, curator, writer, and again, the curator, one of the curators of the biennial. And she's currently a lecturer in modern and contemporary art at American University. So I will go ahead and let Jordan take over and introduce our artist today.
Thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction, and thank you to all of you out there who are with us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. As Emma said, my name is Dr. Jordan Amarconi. I am privileged to be one of the curators for the Atlanta Biennial, and I am so excited today to share virtual space with one of the Atlanta Biennial artists, JoséVillalobos. I could spend quite a long time introducing José to you all, but I will keep it brief. JoséVillalobos is known for artistically protesting culturally accepted traits of toxic masculinity through his performances, installations, sculptures, drawings, and even through fashion. Villalobos grew up in the U.S. on the U.S.-Mexico border in El Paso, Texas, and was raised in a traditional conservative family. His artistic oeuvre reconciles the identity challenges in his life and the ways in which he is working and thinking about the traditional Mexican customs and American mores that have shaped his life and experience, as well as growing up with religious ideals that very often conflict with being gay in the United States and perhaps everywhere. And I think it's also important to say that June is Pride Month. And while we all understand that every day we should be celebrating the struggles, the achievements, the lives, and the risks that queer people have taken to create and shape a more democratic, progressive, open, expansive, and humane world. It's a real treat today to get to think through José's work and his experiences today in relationship to the sort of global celebrations of Pride Month that are taking shape across the next few weeks. I will also before our conversation begins, include my land acknowledgement as well. I am currently talking to you from Brooklyn, New York, which are the historic lands of the Lenape people, and the current lands of the Piscataway Conoy tribes, which received official New York State recognition in 1987. And as a way of starting this conversation, I'm hoping that we can use this conversation to think across intersectional lines and pay attention to the ways in which mainstream culture and predominantly white institutions that support educational as well as artistic work in the United States have been complicit in systems of oppression that have rendered entire communities invisible and decentered from the operations of public life and progress. I ask you to join me in acknowledging all the Indigenous communities, their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement also recognizes that decolonization is not a metaphor, that recognition is only the first step, and that today and in the future, those who benefit from the status quo must do more to untether ourselves and our institutions from the violence of settler colonialism as a way to effect change in the future. And if you are interested in knowing more about the land that you are currently residing on, I encourage you to go to nativeland.ca to learn more about the Indigenous territories and tribes that are near you. So without further ado, I'm going to do what happens in all webinars is say, I'm going to share my screen now and also say hi to José, who is with us at the moment. Hi, Jose. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to get this PowerPoint started. I feel like I'm teaching again. As a way of starting our conversation today, Jose, again, thank you so much for being here today. Tell us where you are at the moment.
I am actually currently in Dallas, Texas, so I'm away from home.
Yeah.
Because I currently just finished installing one of a solo show that I have at the Latino Cultural Center, and it's probably since I would say late 2019, early 2020. This is probably one of my biggest shows.
Yeah.
In the space, so that's currently where I'm at now. I'm excited for today. Today is considered the opening, so there's a small reception, and I will be doing a performance as well. But that's currently where I am at. I miss my own bed.
I know, I'm sure.
But everything is everything's good. Everything's great.
Well, wonderful. We're glad to have you here, and this is a busy weekend for you.
Yes.
And it's been pretty busy for you since I saw you in February for install. So I want to talk a little bit about that too. But as a way of maybe perhaps starting this conversation, one of the things that we're going to do a little bit later is premiere the performance that you made to accompany this work that we're looking at here. This is We Have Always Been, which was first created in 2018 and which I commissioned you to reinstall for the Atlanta Biennial here in Atlanta. In 2021. And as a way of, I feel like the performance and this work are so inextricably tied. And as a way of maybe providing our audience out there with a little bit of introduction to you and to this work in the show, I'd love to hear about this work in particular, how and why it first came about in 2018. And then I will sort of share my own sort of curatorial interest in it as you and I sort of spoke in advance of the exhibition about this work and you know, how excited and honored I am to have it appear in this show.
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, this specific work, this work surfaced from a story that I didn't know existed, and this is kind of how it started to take shape. Now, also, I did come out what I consider at a later time in my life. I guess relatively to my age, right? I came out when I was 22, 23. I'm 32 now, and that kind of created a different conversation with my family with different parts of my family. And I found out that one of my uncles that I'm really close to was also queer, but he tried to come out and couldn't come out. And when I came out to him, there was a deeper understanding of a lot of things. And this work is actually about the silence that exists because we want to satisfy these expectations that have been predetermined by just tradition and family values. So this work is specifically tied to my father and my uncle. And my uncle tried to come out to my father, and my father beat him up and told him that he would not be allowed to be gay until the day that their mother passed away. Mm-hmm. So this is about burying that silence. You know, it's about burying your voice, and it's that silencing that exists and the violence behind it. And so, you know, with all the components of the actual piece is, like, for example, the flowers are tied into the color yellow, and the color yellow is both associated with being courageous, but also being cowardly. Right. So we see the color yellow, how it's used in I guess, in history and the significance of a lot of things. And, it's kind of like this thing of trying to be yourself and having the courage to say something to your brother, but also how it was kept in as well. And he never lived like a true life, according to himself. So this is something that I take personal, because that is also something that was very similar to my experience, right? And it being so close to my family, of course, but a lot of it was that I was trying to give my family what they wanted, and it was all because of expectation. And so it's about burning your freedom, essentially. And so even like the saddle is casting. It's kind of like casting a shadow over the cactus, and the cactus is considered a resilient plant because it almost kind of grows and exists when it barely has any water, but also being overpowered by this structure or this shadow. But it kind of changed too. So just recently, I added one of actually, that's my performance hat, the one that is hanging in the installation. And originally the hat did not exist on this particular installation, because I have an installation with a group of these hats. Mm-hmm. And but I thought it would elevate the work itself too. And the thing about installation for me is that it can shift, and it can change, and it can live. And so I did began adding the hat to the installation as well.
Well, one of the things that sort of drew me to the original iteration of this installation in 2018 was that it had such an incredible resonance for me as both an art historian and someone who knows about the sort of longer architectures and history of art, as this almost like ritual space, that these objects are like sort of hanging in the air, floating, and in some ways kind of interacting with the viewer's space as well, that there's this kind of mid zone that sort of takes these objects off of the wall and places them closer into the experiences and into relationship with the viewer's body, not in a confrontational way, but as almost like a kind of welcoming space that it like invites you to sort of look at and gaze upon and move around these objects in a particular way. And one of the things that I really sort of felt immediately excited about in working with this piece for the Atlanta Biennial was that I wanted to create this corner for you that was kind of an environment, a world, but also a kind of like ritual or even religious space. I think so much about your orientations as an artist, about how you sort of are placing these objects in a gallery, reminds me of how religious icons and even how sort of ritual or spiritual spaces are arranged and installed and designed. Is religion and spirituality something that you think about in your work? I know from our conversations, Norteño Mexican culture is a deeply religious as well as community. Could you talk about the ways in which maybe religion and spirituality take shape in this piece?
Definitely. I mean, religion and spirituality has been something that I grew up with. So I actually was part of, so my family is very like evangelistical type of Christianity, but also some of my dad's side is very Catholic. And so I grew up, very sheltered to a lot of things. And but it's interesting to see as well how the shift of a lot of things, specifically living in the United States, kind of shifts like the dynamic of how family interacts with religion. But there was a time as a kid where we couldn't, we were not supposed to listen to music or play video games or.
As a second generation, I feel that too.
Yeah, so it was kind of a thing that existed. Like we weren't allowed to do certain things. Like women were not supposed to wear shorts or pants, only skirts. So it was a little bit very conservative, but it's through that I also learned that how religion can be constantly used as something as a weapon, right? And also, where do you find that? Where do you find a middle, or where do you find a grounding space too? So for me, and it's kind of something that is, to me, what's very interesting. It's the glorification of things. So, which is why sometimes, like for this piece in particular, it's like gold, and it's very, it's very kind of, how you say, it's like very inviting, and it takes up a space, and it's, it's almost like this glorification of something. And for me, I use religion in the sense that, that imagery of like glorifying something or someone, and how I create this thing that specifically like norteño culture, right? It's like how the man is glorified and how the man is supposed to be. So there's like this tie that happens. But I definitely, so one of the very interesting things is a big inspiration that came from like the way I treated the tats and the saddle in this case is when I was a kid and when I was in Juarez in Mexico, and would take the bus. Their public transportation system is practically just school buses that are painted very bright. And when you go in, the driver has like a small altar. And I remember one particular bus that had fringe, and I found it very interesting. I really loved it, but also the dynamic that exists between like machismo and femininity and masculinity is something that's always battling each other, specifically in this like culture, right? Because I feel that these men are allowed to be flamboyant, but because they're macho, they're not seen through the lens of like, oh, he's gay or whatnot, right? Now, so this is the way I treat the work, right? Make it a lot more flamboyant. And when you're queer and when you're doing something like this, or when you're wearing fringe, or when you're seen through a complete different lens, and you're seen through a lens of like machismo and this specific like role that has been established for, I mean, many years and centuries. And and I'll say it does feel at times like that lens is like, oh, like he's a faggot, or he's this, or he's that, and it's weird to see that, because when you see like these macho men, even performers and musicians, like they wear sparkly outfits and fringy outfits, and it's fine because their music is talking about being macho, and they're allowed to do that. So like they almost get a free pass.
Well, and I think it's something that a lot of your work sort of meddles within, this idea of where is the line between these sort of symbols and gestures and activities and traditions that ensure a kind of toxic masculinity, but also perform with slight alterations and changes a real kind of queer, campy flamboyance.
Right.
And how do we and the ways in which like many cultures sort of surveil and police those borders and render any kind of operation slightly outside of those borders as something different or unacceptable, I think is something that I care about a lot and think about quite a lot, namely because I think the history of art is always sort of operating both within and outside these identities and borders of acceptability, tradition, right, as well as sort of countering those sort of policings and histories and rituals, and the ways in which I sort of think about the ways in which queer artists have contributed the most to a bigger and broader understanding of not just art, but culture writ large, is the way in which you force us to pay attention to those borders, right, and slippages. And I think for this biennial, one of the many themes that I think this work and your work writ large took hold for me in this show, which was, constructed and shaped in such a difficult sort of intersectionally traumatic year, was the way in which so much of how oppression works is through borders and slippages of all kinds.
Right.
And I think this work really, for me, sort of held a space not only of an immigrant and migrant experience in the United States, which I care about a lot, but also the ways in which this is a totally related socio-political experience in relationship to how we're talking about gender, how we're talking about toxic masculinity and Me Too, how we're talking about difference of all kinds. Mm-hmm. And so, just to say to you again, as I have so many times, I'm so excited and so honored to have this work as a part of the show, because I think your particular experiences and histories and struggles and triumphs map onto such a big and broad ecology of experiences for a lot of different kind of people, queer or not. The other thing that I wanted to sort of say is I was so excited when the show had been installed and open to the public that, just watching people interact with it, from little children sort of wandering around in the front to, older adults sort of examining these objects and these sort of different moments in the work. That I think it really is a work that kind of rewards time being spent with it, and to sort of relish in the details, which I think is also a part of kind of the extravagant performances of getting dressed up, right, in Norteño culture, and dancing and singing and celebrating and wearing your pride externally.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about where these objects came from? Did you source them from specific places? Are they yours? Did you find them?
So I usually try to, when I source my material, try to get material that specifically that is, I try not to get anything new. And it's because I feel that it is important for the object to have a history.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for an example, like the boots, I usually source them from like older men who are selling them. Usually it's like they're selling them at the flea market, and that's kind of, and it's kind of beautiful too, at the same time, to kind of see this exchange that happens, right? Because it's almost like whatever they have or they've held on to, they're like kind of passing it on of some sorts. So I try to usually get, my stuff that is has a history to it. And they're not personally mine. I would love them to be personally, something that was passed on to family, but also I'm kind of, in a sense, trying to also because I'm altering these objects too. So, you know, something that had that value, family value, or something deeper, I wouldn't like to alter it. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of where I source my things. Is usually I try to get them from people who have had them. I actually got a pair of boots from like my best friend's one of my best friend's father, and we constantly have the conversation too, because you know, it's very interesting to kind of get something from a person who was like very against being queer, and then using it and altering it and kind of making it into work. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I source my material. Not everything is a found object, but uh, I think there's this quite lovely, I guess, marriage between like the treatment that I give it and the history that it has. Like the boots are worn, and then kind of adding all these like small details, you know, golden trims, and but yeah, I mean, it's fun collecting some things for sure.
I can tell. And, you know, one of the most difficult, I will say, but also incredibly fun for me to watch was to watch you install with the preparators this work, because it is such a delicate and finely tuned work. I mean, to get all of the sort of symmetries and balance of these pieces to hang in the air in this incredibly visually satisfying way is incredibly difficult.
Yes.
And, you know, there's a kind of tenderness as well as frustration that I felt in the install process that I think also shows up in the work too, that there is like an honoring of these materials and their histories and the way in which they're used. But there's also a kind of like frustration in sort of resolving them too. And that was an interesting thing for me to see as a curator as well, that tension shows up not just sort of in what these objects are, but also how they're sort of taking place in space.
Definitely. Installing my work is usually like one of the biggest challenges when it comes.
You're a pro, though. I have to say, you're a pro.
Yeah, I've gotten it down. I have gotten it down to, you know, small tricks and things that I know will work. And because usually a lot of my bigger installation work is suspended, and it's
and prepared to like, oh God, no.
Yes. So it's like, you know, how, and this is where installation for me, this is why it's a challenge every time, right? It is not something that is framed that you can put on a wall. You know, you have to take in consideration like how tall the ceiling is, what type of ceiling can it be used, so can it carry the weight, and it's always kind of a it's always kind of a journey of trying to figure out whether whether everything will be fine in other words. But this is exactly my entire week this week, because I'm currently installing a show that opens today, and it was kind of like, it has never lived in a space, so I don't know how the install is going to go, and there was definitely challenges that existed. And it's also depending on the location. So if, for example, if I wanted to show that piece somewhere else, I would have to make sure that the facility or whatever it is had the capabilities of doing something like that. And it's interesting. For me, it's the funnest part. It's like a puzzle. So for me, it's like trying to figure it out. There's moments of frustration, but then you get you finally see the final product, and I get really happy.
Yeah. And I think, you were talking about the inclusion of the hat, which, we'll talk about in a moment, shows up in the performance as well. I think you're also an artist who's really flexible in thinking about what each space can do and what it can't do, and finding a way to keep the integrity of your work.
Right.
I think is a really important skill when you are working predominantly in installation. Because, as you said, not every space is the same, and finding a way to sort of allow the work to change and shift depending upon where it is and what kind of viewpoints and spaces what does the space allow for, I think is also an exciting part of working with these pieces, that they sort of do their own thing in space with your help and guidance.
Yeah, except when like the preparator is like surprised, and when I'm like, I have to install, so I have to suspend like 10 things. So
yes, shout out also to the preparators who worked on the Atlanta Biennial for this show. What a brilliant, beautiful, patient group of human beings. Thank you to you guys, if any of y'all are out there. I'd like to get into the performance, which, as I said, accompanied the piece for the Atlanta Biennial. And one of the first things that we sort of talked about together when we finally had you on board for the show was that you were very clear from the beginning. You're like, I'd like to do a performance. Right. And, thinking as a curator in the middle of a pandemic about how that would work, I really just so appreciated thinking about what performance could be like in a show that, for so many months of the organization and shaping of it, we didn't know, what an opening would look like, or, if we would have to shut down or close or things like that. And I just so appreciate you being flexible as well as really committed to making this performance happen. And I'm excited to premiere it in a moment. I'm just showing you guys a photograph of Jose in the midst of his performance, which took place in front of his work in the Atlanta Contemporary Galleries. And for those who were sort of in the space with you as you were filming the piece, I know a lot of leadership and staff from the Atlanta Contemporary were there while you did it. And it was incredibly emotional. And not just because of the sort of what happens in the performance, but the week of installation in mid-February of this show, you were in Atlanta with us installing, and the situation in Texas was in a humanitarian emergency, frankly. It was, for those of you who don't recall, the second week in February in Texas, there was some of the coldest temperatures ever reported in the state, as long as records, an incredibly intense ice and snowstorm, which knocked the power out of a huge majority of both urban and rural spaces in Texas. And I just remember, those few days where it was very, very dicey, you speaking with family members at home, your partner at home, wondering if they were okay. And in the midst of this very complex install here, being separated from them, I'm sure was incredibly difficult, as we all sort of had to watch that disaster happen from afar. And, I'm thinking so much about this performance as not just a performance, but also I think performances for you are incredibly emotional, physical experiences. And I'd love for our audience to sort of hear about your relationship to performance. How did performance sort of take shape and come about in your artistic practice? And what does performance help you achieve as an artist?
Right. So performance for me, I feel that performance trickled down through my father. So my father was a musician, and he was also a performer. Like he performed, at bars and things like that in Mexico when he was part of a band or group. So my father would. I'm sorry?
What instruments did he play?
He played the accordion. He played the guitar. He played the bass. He played the piano. So he was he knew music really well, and he knew how to write music, and but he was never formally trained or anything. It was just something that happened out of necessity, for the most part. And there's still some things that in the future, I will love to show. I have this old VHS video of him performing, but he's like performing this comedic act as this specific Mexican person who's like a singer, but he's a comedic singer. So, I think that's kind of where performance kind of existed in my life. And then I lost my father when I was 10. So things kind of had a shift in kind of the way I was brought up and the way I was raised. And a lot of the thing was like trying to make ends meet. I always was creative kid. I was always creative. I would make things out of almost anything. But there was a certain point in my life in which I never thought that I would be an artist. And because I never had that specific accessibility, I think I only went to a museum once when I was a kid, and it was because it was a field trip. So I didn't know much about art until I went to college, and then I saw what was contemporary, and I fell in love with it. And I'm also first generation, so just to be in college was a big deal. So for me, I wasn't going to go to college to be an artist. I was going to go to college to do something with English. So I wanted to become either a writer or an editor or something of that sort. And it just kind of, when I first, you're required to take your basics. I took an art class, and then there's like this moment of falling in love again with like something very, very creative, of visually creative. And I stuck to my guns, and I said, I'm going to be an artist. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. But art also, like the performance aspect of it, was when I first discovered Marina Abramovic. Her work was very impactful to what I didn't know that performance could be. Yeah. Right. So performance for me in my work is there are things that cannot be said in a physical object. Right. I cannot convey these specific messages unless it's written out. But for me, performance is very important because it's very cathartic, and it's very physical for me. And a lot of people have always asked me, why do you do that to yourself? Because for people to understand pain is a very different aspect. So, and I talk about pain in a way of not being able to be myself, the constant assimilation that exists, that it's very emotional, and it's very kind of like this code switch that exists, and having to deal with all of that, right? And so for me, when someone, and I think anybody can relate to this, when someone conveys or portrays a physical pain, you can immediately relate to it. Right. And you can immediately relate to it because we all have bodies. We all know what physical pain is. And when you're able to do that, then there is a connection that starts to happen. Right. I cannot say that everybody has lived my life or everybody has experienced that, because no one has. Right. And but when you start to kind of show this other aspect of things, and a lot of it is physical, the physicality, a lot of things, you start to kind of like feeling it and relating to it, because we all know what it is to be tired. We all know what it is to have any sort of physical pain, whether it's a pinch, a punch, whatever it may be. So that, for me, that's kind of where performance exists, and it exists in this realm of pushing further, like this idea and this and this work of how pain exists and it's not related to any, the way I mean it is, it's like, for example, being a queer brown man is a very particular thing, right? And the white experience is not going to be that. And it goes back to a thing of kind of one thing that I can say is the way I kind of like think of it is that when I was a kid and I lost my father, there would just be like, oh, I'm so sorry that you lost your dad. But there was no connection. There was just the sorry, and there was no, like, I know what that's like. Right.
Empathy, perhaps.
Right. So then when I convey certain things in my performances, people will automatically like feel it in a third sense, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I mean,
right.
I think that there's like a visceral extension of what you are doing into an audience member watching, that it kind of closes this gap between watching and experiencing, that I think is very interesting, and that I think also Marina Abramovic is very interested in closing that gap too. So it makes total sense to me that you sort of acknowledge her. I have some questions for after the performance, but I think it'd be good to screen it now, if that's all right.
El cariño se recibe, nunca se da. Silencio. Mi realidad existe en algún lugar. Silencio. Ser hombre, entero. Silencio. El silencio entierra mi voz. Silencio. Assimilate, protect. Silence.
Wow, Jose, thank you for sharing that with us today. And I have to say, I've watched this video many, many times, and every time I see something different and perhaps even feel something different each time I watch it. So thank you for allowing us to premiere and share that. How do you feel after seeing it now?
I I do feel, I mean, especially with the work that is happening right now, is there is a big shift in my work, and it's an important shift because I feel really good. I feel that it is important to talk about that silence that exists, right? And how silencing is a weapon, and it's violent. It's because of some, like maybe untraditionalism of some sort, right? That it exists, and there is a shift in my work that I was a little bit scared, but also, it's exciting to see. Is that for a bit, the way I was treating my work, I was making it, altering and making it flamboyant, but it's about kind of subverting this idea of machismo. And one thing that is happening right now with my work is talking about the violence of masculinity, right? And with this show that that opens today, and even actually started with my art pace work, with there's a shift in the work that is a little bit more raw. It's a little bit less colorful, and it's a little more serious. And I mean, all my work is serious, but that's not the first impression some people get, right? Because they're seeing something very attractive, very pretty. And so kind of looking back at this video and seeing, these are things that are constantly happening, right? And this is not just being queer. This is about being, just being different, right? And just recently, we're seeing a lot of things happen, and we're seeing a lot of things unfold. We're talking about like Palestine, what is currently happening with Colombia, and all of these things, right? And the way I start to see things too is, as by my mother being an immigrant too, and my father grew up in Mexico, but he was born in Texas, but lived his entire life in Mexico. So, assimilating to that culture, and kind of also seeing how we seek a better life, and yet it's still something that is very tragic, and it's very difficult to do. So, and it's just something that is real, and it's they're kind of starting to reflect a lot more of that in my work, of how being this, in my case, being brown and queer is not, it's not pretty, it's not, and it's kind of also highlighting these very negative aspects that kind of exist. And we're talking about like hate crimes, and so seeing the work, it's kind of like I do see like the shift. I don't know. I think it's like an entryway, right? It's seeing this performance, and then kind of seeing like what I'm doing now. It's something that I'm definitely interested in continuing and exploring, because I think that when we sweep something under the rug, we just kind of forget about it. And for me, it's important to talk about what does exist and what is kind of overseen. Yeah. It's for me, it's so weird to see performing myself, myself performing. And I think it's because, one, I have this weird thing of like, I don't like the way I sound, or like the smallest thing in the world, but
I don't think you're alone in that.
But you know,
hearing anybody hearing their like own voices, like
right. So every time I see a performance that I recorded, I'm always like nitpicking at the smallest things, like, oh my God, I could have done this better. Or, but no, I do definitely. I mean, it's still, and the loudness of the chime is something that has to be experienced. Like it's deafening, right? And it's something that it's right in my ears. And so there's that one other aspect of performance is like it's quite different when it's on video than when it's live. But yeah, I mean
well, you raise a really interesting thing, and it's actually something that came up as we were putting the show together, where you were like, I am so excited for this piece to be included in the biennial, but I'm also going through a lot of deep shifts and thinking about my practice. And I totally understand now, after having sort of gone through the process of production with you, from the install to the performance, that the performance is really doing both really shared things with the installations, but through very different tactics and through very different means. And, I think the real question for so many artists of color and women artists who are thinking very thoughtfully and sensitively and powerfully about what it means for their work to be displayed in art institutions is, how do you want people to engage your work? What do you want them to come away with? And what do you want them to hold on to? And how do you want them to enter into something that might be different from them?
Right.
And this is a question that comes up in my conversations with so many kind of artists, which I think is really important to talk about, that, there is a real aestheticization that happens in art spaces, in museums, in galleries, that renders often very difficult works into something more palatable, more slick, more appealing for a viewer. And in many cases, we can assume to be a privileged white viewer. And there is a power to that, but that can also be a really difficult thing to navigate when the work is about you and your life and your experiences and things that have shaped you and perhaps traumatized you.
Right.
And I'm so glad that we're airing this performance in a time where I think a lot of art institutions, curators, people in power in the art world are really having to rethink this idea of representation is all we have to do. As long as we sort of represent in our galleries a quote unquote diverse offering of artists and makers, our work is done. Mm-hmm. And what actually is happening now, I think, is that representation is a first step, but it very often contributes to a kind of absorption of difference in a way that doesn't require any follow through to be thinking about what next steps are actually necessary for a truly supportive, inclusive, and equitable art world. And I think your performance and the rage of it, the duration of it, the physical distress of it speaks to something pointier, angrier, more unresolved, that I think is really important to think about when it comes to how we sort of exhibit marginalized identities and experiences and communities
right.
in the art world. What is required? And what kind of resistances are still possible?
Right.
That's a really important space for me as a curator to think about. So I just
and another thing about specifically this performance, and this is also another thing that I've learned through the process of just being an artist and accepting myself as for who I am, is that um, the presence of saying, I am here, listen to me, I'm making this noise, is super important, right? Because then we start breaking down like the ideas of people of color being in white spaces, right? We can also take up a space. We can also create beautiful artwork. We can also share our experiences, right?
Totally.
So for me, that's very important too. You know, it's important to myself as well to think about also, I am queer. It's okay. You can be it and you can do it. And, you know, and I do this by, you know, the outfits that I create and, you know, for either performance or for just reception or whatever it may be. Right. And it's taking all of that and making it, kind of like making, you know, like holding others accountable to see me. Right. Yeah. And to know that this is me and I do take up a space. Right. And so I don't know, it's just, yeah, it's very interesting. And also just that performance, also talking about sound and how loud it was and the presence that it took to create something like that. It's, you know, and you know, of course I would love what, you know, there to have been an audience, you know, a bigger audience, but I understand that in these times, but also, you know, the echo of that sound kind of just sticks with me. It's just like, this is something that's still experienced and this is something that still exists.
Yeah, it's like it changes your physical experience, but also the space itself. It's like there's like reverberations of you.
Right.
Like sonic reverberations of you,
right,
along with the sort of physical aspect that I think I completely understand and agree with what you're saying. It's like a little bit of a haunting of the space.
Right.
Sort of remain there longer in that way.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I am absolutely happy to open up the space for questions. Should anyone have any questions, feel free to place them in the Q&A box. I don't see any at the moment, which is fine. But also maybe we could, as we're maybe waiting for that, Jose, you could tell people a little bit about what you're working on right now, as in like today.
Yeah. Yeah. So this.
You've been so busy since I've seen you in February, which is great.
Yes, it's been, you know, it's been crazy, but good.
Yeah.
But today I have an opening for it's a solo show at the Dallas Latino Cultural Center. It's one of the biggest shows that I've done. It's all new work and it's a big space. And this specific work that I'm creating for the space is talking about the measures and the violence of masculinity, in particular to something that exists that I did not know. And it is the BEM sex role inventory, which is a psychological test that is given to determine how feminine or masculine you are.
Could you say the name of that test one more time?
Yeah, BEM. It's the BEM sex role inventory.
Okay.
And so there is this writer, his name is Alfredo Miranda, and he wrote this book on machismo and Latino masculinity. And he kind of revisits this psychological test and then he reassesses it by including what's called dichos, which are like phrases that we kind of hear. And so it's kind of modeled after the BEM sex role inventory. It's really close, but it's things that are put into certain categories to kind of determine like masculinity. And it's things like men should not show their emotions. So it's like a whole scoring system.
Wow.
And everything is based off of that, right? And to me, when I first found this and I started researching a little bit about this a little more, I was kind of surprised and kind of like taken aback that the fact that just thinking about the idea of why is there a test to determine how masculine or feminine you are?
Yeah, as if it's like quantifiable. It's fascinating.
Right. And it's something,
a fascinating discipline.
yeah. And, and it's also like to just considering that something as such exists is like also another form of violence, right? Like it's like predetermining like how you should be and how you should act or how you should exist in a way. So
and it's not like it was a survey where there was like people were invited to discuss and talk about their experiences with these things. It's as if it can be sort of rendered symptomatic,
right,
and quantifiable.
Right. So with this work, that's what I'm doing. So I'm kind of taking all of this information and kind of also I researched a lot of like hate crimes that started happening or that have happened. So there is, I'm talking about a very real issue, and and kind of just not sugarcoating anything with pretty, right? So this is the violence that exists, and this is what masculinity can do, and how it can create like these tragedies. So, what I did for a lot of this work was, one, I kind of developed like paintings and works based on this test. And then also I grabbed a lot of information of things that happened, like a gay man who was set on fire, a gay man who was buried alive.
Are these hate crimes that you're gathering specific to a place? Are you gathering them from a range?
It's kind of, I'm gathering them from kind of everywhere. So a lot of it has been a lot of like these specific cases that I'm portraying in the work have been to the United States and Mexico. And, there's this one piece that I casted these belt buckles out of concrete to kind of resemble stones. There was this queer kid who was stoned to death in 2019, and they carved into his stomach and saying he was an empty vessel and he was a faggot. Right. So it's so that's one of the works I also have in the, and it's kind of, so I've kind of made this whole work in a sense, it's kind of like looking at it and also kind of like, how can I explain it? When a mom says, I wish I could take that pain away from you, it's kind of like also that approach too. Right. Because I'm portraying these things, but I'm portraying them in my image, right? And so I mean, this whole work is it's getting serious, and it's a shift, but I'm excited to see it because I mean, and I talk about like this particular piece that's currently on the screen, that it's the fact that some people are forced to leave and take everything that they have and not have a home, right? It's like super important, and that's so violent to not be welcomed anywhere, and to kind of just move forward. And so this piece is kind of geared towards that. It's like how many kids now are homeless because they're queer, or all you have is your own bags and you're carrying that weight by yourself. So also taking that ownership is very personal, very deep to a lot of things that are happening. But this work is very emotional, as you can tell.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm excited for that shift too, because this is something that is super important to talk about, right? And it's super important to show people that this idea, also talking to like some queer people, right? Like the idea of a queer white person, especially if it's a gay man, like it's all flamboyancy. It's all, there's this like kind of thing that exists, right? Like, and it's just like, the queer community has its own issues too. And when it comes down to racism, and it comes down to fat phobia, and it comes to a lot of things, transphobia, all these things are real issues. And this is, and for me, being brown and a queer person and being in this space, right? And it's kind of navigating through it, also coming out later in life is like, how do I navigate being gay and brown? Also, how do I navigate being gay and brown in the queer community?
Yeah.
Right. And, but I mean, that's just kind of, yeah. So, I mean, this shift, it's very important, to talk about these issues. There's this one particular piece that, I, love, and you can kind of see it towards the right in the background, is I actually gathered pieces of my grandparents' home in Mexico. And I created these image transfers. So there's photographs on the pieces of wall, and it's kind of just, once again, going back to this idea of like a child not feeling safe to be who they are, and always hiding, and always like kind of just being like in the background, or like a wallflower, or and it's but it's also like hearing a history of all the men in my family. So all the pictures are like of me when I was a kid, and then all the men that kind of like shape what you're supposed to be, right? And that's being told how to be and what men should do is it's something that we still struggle with, and it's something that I see, whether it's my sister telling her kid something, or it's a violence that exists that we don't acknowledge, because you are not letting somebody be as they are. So, so, I mean, that's kind of like where the work is going. But I mean, there's also another part of my work that I want to keep exploring, such as like the historical aspect of Latin men, and how queerness is always kind of silenced. So kind of the Art Pace exhibition that I currently have right now up at Art Pace, talking about the Mexican farm workers, and talking about the queer individual or one particular story of a queer individual who was known to be queer, and he would sleep with other men. And, it's also trying to highlight these voices as well that are constantly silenced, and why can't we take acknowledgement that there was queer people at that time doing at a very important time in history, such as like the braceros, like it was a big movement. This is something that happened on a global kind of platform, right? Which is right after, or right when World War II started, and the United States had nobody to farm their land, so they contracted Mexicans to do it. And also like the rigor of trying to get to the United States, and having all this also racism, the way they were treated. And so, it's a lot of things that we don't talk about, but also we don't talk about like the existence of like queer voices in these spaces, which is like kind of where my work is starting to shift.
Well, and I think one of the really interesting things that, I sort of glean from your work, particularly as someone who I think exhibits quite a lot in their home state, of Texas, is that it is just,
which is like 5 other states in regular America.
The size of like, a Latin American country in a lot of instances, is that, it's a reminder to me of how important this work is to be exhibited in places where these issues are being parsed out and argued and debated, if we can even call it a debate. I don't even, that's also a controversial way to think about this, but the way in which these issues of homophobia, transphobia, immigration, exhalation, all of these issues are being parsed out the most intensely, the most violently, and the power of art institutions in these spaces to be spaces where that violence can be questioned, critiqued, and contested. I think, yes, we should be critical of art institutions for sure. They are not neutral spaces. They have been complicit in harms, many of the harms that your work talks about for centuries. But I think they can also be spaces where presentation can be a form of resistance and discussion and love and care for communities that you are talking to in your work too. And, that was sort of a huge part of why I wanted you to be a part of this show, because I do have this contested relationship with the art world and the art institution. But as a second generation person who's not from here, I also know that the biggest lessons and the biggest sort of ways in which I came to understand myself, my community, my experiences, and how I wanted to sort of love and be loved in the world happened in front of artworks made by people like you. And I think we have to hold that too simultaneously, that there's like a real power and beauty in that. And I just thank you for doing that hard work all the time, and taking that kind of responsibility in your work. That's a real weight too, and we're also appreciative. I think we will end here, Jose.
Okay.
But I, again, appreciate you so much for talking to me on this beautiful Saturday, at least where I am.
It's a little gloomy on my end, but it might get better.
Good. Good. And I hope we get to see each other and talk to each other soon.
Definitely.
I am so excited that this got to be shared and aired with a bigger and broader audience. So thank you for your collaboration and participation. And thank you to the Atlanta Contemporary staff and leadership for supporting this program as well. It's been a treat.
Thank you guys both. This is Emma one last time. Thank you guys both for hosting this today. We really appreciate it. It was wonderful to see the performance in front of more than just the staff, the people who are lucky enough to be there the first time. For our audience, thank you again for joining us. This video has been recorded and will be up on our YouTube page soon. Of Care and Destruction is up until August 1st. So if you haven't come to see the show in person, definitely join us then. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful Saturday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Emma. Thank
Bye.
you, Jose. Thank you, Emma, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.